Great to have you guys here today. Hope you're enjoying this fabulous summer weekend. So glad you've taken time out of this weekend so that we can kind of disconnect with the busyness of our lives and reconnect with the heart of God. Let me give a big shout out to those of you who are watching live online right now. In fact, everybody here in the room at our Dixon City campus, let's make everybody online feel welcome as they're watching the service. Great to have you guys with us as well. Today we're continuing this teaching series. It's called Jesus On. And throughout the summer, we're just talking about what Jesus had to say on some of the most important issues of our lives. And as a roadmap for this series, we've been making our way through what's called today the Sermon on the Mount, which is the longest single teaching of Jesus recorded anywhere in the Bible. It's in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And today we come to a portion of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus gets very practical and even kind of personal, because he talks about how we view and how we manage our money and our possession, what we do with all the stuff of our lives. And let me just give you a warning right up front that what Jesus teaches in this passage it's very, very countercultural. And if you're serious about following Jesus, then you're going to have to reject a lot of the messages that we hear every single day in our culture. And we're going to find ourselves swimming upstream in a world that's rapidly going downstream. So as we think about the subject of eternity and money and our possessions, our stuff, and what we do with that, let me just start out with kind of a fun question. So here's a question to get you thinking about this topic. What would you do with $1 million? Okay, so if somebody handed you $1 million right now, how would you spend it? What would you do with it? I was thinking about this because I came across an article online that listed some of the different ways that you could spend $1 million. So, for example, maybe you're the kind of person who loves to travel. And you could go to Geneva, Switzerland, and you could stay in the Hotel President Wilson. This is a picture of the penthouse suite. And it rents for $65,000 a night. So in 15 days, you could spend that entire $1 million right there. Or you could stay at the Econo Lodge in Scranton for 60 years with that $1 million. It's great to live in northeastern Pennsylvania, isn't it? Or maybe you're really into cars. You could get 2 of these cars for $1 million. This is a Rolls-Royce Phantom convertible. The base price, stripped down model, $490,000, and it goes up from there. If you're really into convertibles, though, you can get 55 of these for your $1 million. Let's suppose you're a person who likes to eat and you really like pudding. You could get the Lindith Howe Country Pudding, and this is only available at the Lindith Howe Hotel in London. And this was a specially created dessert, the most expensive dessert ever. It has edible gold leaf, I don't know why, and it also comes with a complimentary 2-carat diamond. This is $35,000 for one dessert. You get 28 of those. Or if you're into pudding, you get 4 million of these, okay? Snack packs. What would you do with $1 million? Decisions. But the truth is, the vast majority of us here will never have to make that decision, right? We won't. It'd be fun to think about, but we won't have to make that decision. But here's what we do. We decide every single day what we're going to do with the time, the money, and the resources that God has entrusted to us. And those decisions that we make every single day are just as important. They are decisions with eternal and spiritual significance. So let me just read to you what Jesus says here in Matthew chapter 6, in the middle of this sermon that he gave on a mountainside one day to his followers. Listen carefully. I'll read through it, and then we'll go back and unpack it a little bit. He said this: "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" He says, "No one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Now, if I were to summarize those 6 verses in the Sermon on the Mount into one statement, I would summarize it this way. Not original with me. I heard this from somebody else this week, but I think this is powerful. It's a warning I think Jesus was giving. I think he was saying this: be careful that you don't end up making a living at the expense of making a life. Like, don't get so focused on the accumulation of stuff that you really miss the greater point of the life for which God has created you. So as we unpack the words of Jesus here, I want to give you 3 questions. I want to build this message around 3 questions that we all have to struggle with. 3 questions that I think came right out of this passage, and 3 questions that will help us not just to make a living, but actually make a life that matters. The first question is this: where is my treasure? Because Jesus begins here and he describes 2 investments that every single one of us can make. We can invest in earthly treasure, or we can invest in heavenly treasure. Here's how it begins, verse 19. He says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth." And I think this verse is especially relevant to Americans living in 2019. Because we have a lot of treasures, especially compared to people living in other parts of the world like Kenya and other points in history. We have a lot, and we've gotten very good at storing it up. We really have. Let me show you some stats. Back in the 1930s, the number of outfits in the closet of the average American woman was 9. Today, the average number of outfits is 30. We just made our closets bigger. And by the way, I couldn't find any stats for men. I'm sure they'd be comparable, just that the outfits wouldn't match. Think about houses. In 1950, the average home was 983 square feet. Today, a new home that's built is now somewhere north of 2,500 square feet on average. So houses now have gotten 2.5 times bigger so that we can store up our earthly treasures. And here's what's interesting about this. Since 1950, families have gotten a lot smaller, right? Fewer kids, and yet our homes have gotten a lot bigger. And even though our homes are so much bigger, we still run out of places to store all of our earthly treasures. 75% of garages have no room for a vehicle. I won't ask for a raise of hands on that one. And because our garages are full and our houses are full, there's been an explosion in the self-storage industry. There's now 2.3 billion square feet of rentable self-storage space in the U.S. because now we need little houses for our stuff that we rent. A 65% increase. Now 1 in 10 families rent a storage unit for all their extra stuff. I just think that's very interesting. When Jesus talks about storing up treasure on earth, we are very good at that. Now, don't get me wrong. I am very grateful that we live in a free and prosperous nation where we have an abundance. But let's get a reality check on all this stuff, okay? Because here's what Jesus goes on to say. Verse 19, he says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal." So in that day and in that culture, people did not collect wealth in a bank account or the stock market. There was no such thing. Predominantly, wealth was held in tangible assets, physical possessions. So one example of that was clothing. Clothing in those days was a great symbol of wealth because clothing was handmade, and so only the wealthiest people could have more than 1 or 2 outfits. But everything was made of, cotton and wool and linen. There was no polyester yet. And so you could accumulate clothing at the risk of it literally being eaten. Your wealth could be eaten by moths. Or if you accumulate your wealth in precious metals and coins and things like that, it could decay over time. It could corrode. It could rust. Or it could just get stolen. So here's the point Jesus was making. He's saying all this stuff that we like to store up, all the stuff that, we work so hard to get, that we pile up, that we fight over, that we go into debt over, it is all very temporary. It's going to rust, it's going to rot, it's going to get stolen. And by the way, even if it doesn't rust, rot, or get stolen, guess what happens when you die? It all stays here, right? Like Solomon said in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, naked a man comes from his mother's womb, and as he comes, so he departs. He takes nothing from his labor that he can carry in his hand. Whatever you have in earthly treasures stored up here, when you leave, it stays. And your kids will fight over it, and eventually it'll end up in a landfill. And that's just reality, okay? You probably recognize the name John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller is widely considered the wealthiest American who has ever lived. He made his money in the oil business at the peak of his career. He controlled 90% of oil production in the United States. He's a very, very wealthy man. Just to give you a comparison, right now, the wealthiest person in the world, from what I understand, is Jeff Bezos of Amazon. His net worth is $131 billion. Okay, if you adjust for inflation, John D. Rockefeller's net worth was $400 billion. He died, and after he died, somebody said to his accountant, how much did Rockefeller leave behind? You know what the answer is, don't you? All of it. Doesn't matter how much you have. It all stays here when you go. Now, does that mean it's wrong to own material things or wrong to enjoy material things? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means this. Keep it in perspective. It's all temporary. Don't cling to it too tightly. Don't build your identity around that stuff. Don't spend your life chasing that stuff at the expense of what really matters ultimately. So then, Jesus goes on and gives the alternative here in verse 20. He says, don't store up treasures on earth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. Now, what in the world does that mean? What was Jesus talking about when he said, store up treasure in heaven? And by the way, let me just point out that this is not a unique idea. This is an idea that you find all throughout the Bible. Like later on in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus was having this conversation with a man whose wealth really was his God. And Jesus answered him and said, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Luke chapter 14, Jesus was teaching, and he said this. He said, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you in this life, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Like someday, you're going to be repaid, rewarded for your sacrifices in this life. The Apostle Paul, who was a key leader in the early church in the first century, was writing a letter to Timothy, an up-and-coming young leader. And he said this, command those who are rich in this present world, which, by the way, honestly is all of us. If we compare ourselves across history and with people around the world, we are rich in this present world. Command those who are rich in this present world to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. And here's why. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. So here's what it means. You can't take it with you. But you know what the Bible says? You know what Jesus was saying? He was saying there is a sense in which you can send it on ahead. Like he's saying that heaven will not be the same experience for everyone. Like what we do in this life, through our generosity, through our compassion, through the way that we use our time, the way that we use our money, will someday create for us an eternal and spiritual reward that we, looking back, will never, ever regret. It means taking some of the time and energy and money that I would typically use to pursue the American dream, and I would use that time, money, and energy to do God's work in this world. Let me give you a few specific examples of what I think treasure in heaven might look like. I've shown you this picture before. This is Sharon. And Sharon is 14 years old, and she lives in the village of Tumutumu, Kenya. Our team just came back from there, probably interacted with her a little bit. Sharon has 3 brothers, and they live in a mud brick 3-room home in Tumutumu. And they have no indoor plumbing, no running water, no car, no air conditioning, no computers, no cell phones, any of that stuff. But my family and I, we have the privilege of supporting Sharon financially every month through an organization called the 410 Bridge. And our support allows her to get a formal education so that hopefully she can break the cycle of poverty and make a difference in her community. Now, that means for our family that there are things in our budget that we don't get to have. There are things that we give up because we don't have as much money to work with. But here's the trade-off. Someday, I'll get to meet Sharon in eternity in heaven and maybe meet her children and her grandchildren as she passes on her faith to succeeding generations because she has become a follower of Christ. Now, our clothes are going to wear out. Our cars are going to rust away. They're well on their way to doing that already. They're going to rust away. Our house will eventually be owned by someone else. That's all earthly treasure. This is heavenly treasure. Give you another example. This is a picture of one of our kids' classrooms right down the hall. Some of our kids worshiping together, learning together. The reason we do this is because we have hundreds of people in this church who are generous and allow us to have classrooms and curriculum and staff to oversee all of this. And there are families in our church who make decisions to give up, earthly treasure to invest in heavenly treasure. And here's what I believe, if that describes you. I believe that someday you may step into heaven, step into eternity, and there will be people who come up to you and say, you don't know me, we've never met, but I became a follower of Christ in a kids program at Parker Hill Church, and it changed my life. It changed my trajectory, changed my eternity. And so I want to thank you. See, that is eternal treasure. That's heavenly treasure. Show you one more picture. This is some of our high school students here at Parker Hill. And earlier this month, about 40 of our high school kids and their leaders spent a week in Birmingham, Alabama, working with Habitat for Humanity. It's a trip that we do every single year. And what they did was they finished the construction on a new home that was going to be given to a family there in Birmingham that didn't have a decent home in which to live. Now, this was not a free trip for our students. They had to raise hundreds of dollars each. Some of them worked extra jobs. Some of them did fundraising. Some of you actually supported them in this. Now, they had other options. They didn't have to spend this time during the summer, very hot days, very long days, working without complaining just to bless a family that they'd never met before. They didn't have to do that. In fact, a bunch of them are in this service. Let's just applaud for them, for their sacrifices. Here's what I want you to understand. They didn't just build a house, and they weren't just building character. They were storing up treasure in heaven. They actually got to meet the family briefly that would get to live in this house. And maybe someday we'll see them again in eternity. See, that's what it looks like to store up treasure in heaven. So the first question is this: where is your treasure? See, any treasure that you store up here on earth, the truth is you lose it eventually. Treasure you store up in eternity in heaven can never be taken away from you. Now, again, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with having material things or enjoying material things. I'm just saying this: it's tragic to come to the end of your life as a follower of Christ and look back and realize that you stored up a lot of stuff in this world, but really didn't do anything to store up treasure in the life to come. Then Jesus goes on, he makes this incredible statement in verse 21. He says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, you know what? This isn't even just a spiritual idea. This isn't even just like a Bible idea or a church idea. This is just a fact of life. There is an undeniable and unbreakable connection between our resources and our hearts. And wherever your money goes, your heart's going to follow. Like if you take your entire retirement fund, your 401k, and you put that in Apple computer stock, that's where your heart's going to be, I guarantee it. You're going to be watching their business performance. You're going to be checking the Apple stock every day. You're going to be telling everybody to buy Apple products, right? You sink a lot of money into a new car, that's where your heart's going to be. You're going to wash that thing every week. You're going to park it at the back of the parking lot so nobody dings it, right? The first time you get a dent in it, you're going to be depressed. Because wherever your treasure goes, that's where your heart goes. And listen, when we store up all of our treasure in this world, our hearts remain deeply connected to this world. But when we choose to store up treasure in heaven, in eternity, there's something that happens in our hearts. Our hearts are drawn toward the heart of God. It changes the way that we live. It changes the way we think. It changes us from the inside out because our hearts suddenly become more connected to the things that are connected to the heart of God. So the first question, where is my treasure? When you get to the end of your life, what are you going to leave behind? A pile of stuff for your kids to sort through? Or are you going to leave behind a legacy of changed lives and eternal impact? Because if all you do is store up treasure in this world, you'll make a living, maybe a real good one. You won't really make a life, not one that matters. Here's the second question. What is my vision? What is my vision for my life and for the future? Jesus goes on here in verse 22, and when you first read this, it's almost like he's changing subjects, like this comes out of nowhere. He says this, he says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. He's talking about physical vision here. It's a unique description of how eyesight really works. Like when you open your eyes, then light floods in. It creates an image in your brain, and you see. And when your eyes are open, it's almost as if your whole body is full of light, kind of what he's describing here. But when your eyesight begins to deteriorate, then everything begins to get dim, and there's like a darkness that begins to increase inside of you. He's just describing physical sight. Then he goes on and makes the connection between the physical and the spiritual. If then the light within you, in other words, if then the light within your heart is darkness, how great is that darkness? In other words, he's saying, listen, there's physical sight, but then there's spiritual sight. And when your spiritual eyes are good, that means the eyes of your heart are focused on God and his priorities and his goodness. And when that happens, your heart gets filled with his light and his love, and it makes a difference. But when your spiritual eyesight begins to deteriorate, you get short-sighted. You only start to see what's right in front of you. You start to think that this world is all there is, and this world is all that matters. You may have physical sight, he says, but you don't have real vision. As I was reading this, I couldn't help but think of Helen Keller, one of the most fascinating people in history, in my opinion. You don't hear much about her anymore. But Helen Keller lived in the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. But as a baby, at 19 months old, she was stricken with an illness that left her both deaf and blind. And in the late 1800s, if you had a child with a disability, oftentimes people would just write them off. But her parents loved her, and they didn't want to give up on her, so they hired someone named Anne Sullivan to help her and to teach her. And eventually, even though she was both deaf and blind, eventually Helen Keller learned to read and write. And eventually she graduated with honor from Radcliffe College. She was the very first person, both deaf and blind, to earn a bachelor's degree. And she went on to become an advocate for people with disabilities. But one day somebody asked her if she could think of anything worse than being blind. And here's what she said. She said, the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. And I really think that way too many people, and even way too many followers of Christ, have physical sight, but they just lack vision for life and God's vision for what their life should be about. It's like somebody sitting on their boat on a lake, sipping on a drink, and they sit there and they say, man, this is what life is all about. No, it's not. I mean, the lake and the boat and the drink, they're all good. Enjoy it. But that is not what life is all about. And that if that is the total vision for your one and only short life in this world, that's a sad, pathetic vision. I mean, you have sight, but you don't really have vision. So Jesus says, okay, where's your treasure? Is it on earth or is it in eternity? And what is your vision? Because if you don't have an eternal vision, you're just going to make a living. But you won't ever really make a life. And then here's the third question. Who am I serving? Who am I serving? Verse 24. No one, he says, can serve two masters. Again, he was speaking within a cultural context where they had slavery, where they had servants, and so there was no such thing as a servant with two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. And then he says this, you cannot serve both God and you might expect him to say, you cannot serve both God and Satan, or you cannot serve both God and evil. He says, you cannot serve both God and money. And in most translations of the Bible, the word money is capitalized because it's personified. And the point he's making is this, that there are two forces at work in your life that will compete for your affection. There is God, and there is all the stuff of this world. And Jesus is simply pointing out one of the fundamental realities of our existence. There's only one true leader in your life. There is only one true God operating in your heart. But here's what we all figure out eventually in life, that material things have such a magnetic power over our souls that we can begin to serve our stuff. instead of serving God. Now again, it's not wrong to manage your money in such a way that you put your kids through college and set up a retirement fund and pay your bills and go on a vacation, enjoy all that stuff. That's not the point here. The point is this: don't let what you own eventually own you. Don't let your possessions possess you. Don't let that become the greatest affection in your life and the source of your greatest allegiance. Now, let me meddle a little bit. If you came to church today and you heard the message beginning, you found out it was about money and possessions, and you started to build up some resistance in your heart and clench your fists and think, I don't want to hear about this. This might be a struggle for you right here. Who are you following? Who are you serving? Let me tell you two ways that I observe that we can be mastered by our stuff. Number one, our stuff can master us emotionally. Like I've realized this, that every time I get another possession, it's another thing I have to manage, I have to clean, I have to insure, I have to upgrade, I have to recharge, I have to store. And we are blessed to live in such abundance, but the truth is, it can be a distraction from the things that really matter in life. There can be a downside to all that. And what we own can begin to own us, and our possessions can begin to possess us. And it gets to the point where I don't have time in my life anymore, energy in my life anymore to love God or love others, the two greatest commandments, because my life is so full of stuff that I have to manage. Now, I'll bet some of you know what I'm talking about, because this is a pressure that more and more and more Americans feel, to the extent that you can now hire a professional organizer to come in and organize your house and organize your life. I mean, what a great country we live in, right? We got so much stuff, we actually hire people to organize it for us. Some of the best-selling books out there and some of those popular TV shows out there are books and TV shows about how to simplify your life and how to organize all the stuff that you have to manage. Here's the truth about storing up stuff on earth. It can eventually become an emotional burden, and there's a certain sense of freedom that comes with simplicity. Second thing is this: stuff can master us financially, because the more we own and the more we get, the more time we have to spend working to pay for it all. And the American story is a story of getting in debt so that I can pay for the stuff that I want to have, and then I spend all my time working to pay off that debt. Ellen Goodman, a columnist, she said it so well. She said, normal in America is getting dressed in clothes that you buy for work, driving through traffic in a car that you're still paying for, in order to get to the job that you need so you can pay for the clothes, the car, and the house you leave empty all day in order to afford it. That's where we live sometimes, isn't it? Who am I serving? Really? Who am I serving? Let me suggest something. I've suggested this before, but take your credit cards, take your debit cards, and get a Sharpie pen. And at the top of the card, in big letters above your name, if you're a Christian, put the name Jesus. Just write it right on there. Just as a reminder of who you ultimately serve, who you follow. The one who really is your master, not MasterCard. And that will do two things if you do that. You'll spend your money a lot more carefully, and you'll have some fascinating conversations with the cashiers when you check out every time. They'll say, you're one of those people from Parker Hill, aren't you? So, where is my treasure? What is my vision? Who am I serving? Now, you may be thinking, okay, it sounds good. How do I apply this? I mean, what do I do with a message like this? Does this mean that I can't buy that new car? Does this mean I shouldn't have a second home? Does this mean that I have to tell my wife she can only have 9 outfits in the closet? Does this mean I can't get the new big screen TV? I mean, what does this mean practically? Because this is complicated, right? We all got to have a house to live in. We need cars to get to work. We got medical bills to pay. We got phone bills to pay, all that stuff. But I'm not here to give you answers. That's not my goal today. My goal is simply this. My goal is to get you to wrestle with this stuff and not just be driven constantly by the messages and the pressures of our culture that tell us that the ultimate goal of life is to get as much as you can and can as much as you get and then sit on the can until you die. No, don't forget this. That you got to be careful that you don't end up making a living at the expense of making a life. So let me just give you a simple strategy that works for me. It works for a lot of people around here. When it comes to, this is my like storing up in heaven treasure strategy. This is a generosity strategy. Think of 3 words: percentage, priority, progressive. So here's what I would invite you to do. You think about, what God has blessed you with in terms of whatever income you have, little or much. And then you say, out of everything that God pours into my life, I'm going to take this percentage, and instead of just piling it up, I'm going to give it away. Not an amount, a percentage, because the Bible, whenever it talks about generosity, always talks in terms of a percentage, never in terms of an amount, because an amount really isn't that relevant. But what percentage? And maybe you're not at the point where you can do what the Bible calls a tithe, which is 10%. So pick a percentage, 3%, 5%. Of everything I get, I'm just going to give away to advance God's kingdom through this church, through this organization, whatever it might be. Start with a percentage, then make it a priority. In other words, not the last thing you think of, but the first thing that you do, so that this never gets neglected. It's kind of like retirement planning. If you have a retirement plan, any financial advisor will tell you, start when you're young, take a percentage of your income, and before you ever touch it, take it right out of your paycheck, put it in that retirement account so that when you hit whatever age you're going to retire at, there's something there for you. Same idea here. So that when you kick the bucket in this world, there's going to be treasure stored up in heaven because you've chosen through a system to be intentionally generous. Make it a percentage, make it a priority, and then make it progressive. What that means is this: as you grow in your faith, as God blesses your life, you just say, well, I'm going to increase that percentage, and I'm going to shift more of my attention and more of my resources from storing up stuff on earth to storing up treasure in heaven. So where's my treasure? What is my vision? Who am I serving? Let me close with this. In the early 1800s, there was a new type of jewelry that became popular in the country of Prussia, which is now known as Germany. And that was iron jewelry. And up until that time in history, iron jewelry was only worn as a sign of mourning or a sign of loss because it was cheap and it was black in color. So it was always a symbol of mourning or loss. But in the early 1800s in Prussia, iron jewelry became very popular for this reason. At that point in time, they were fighting against the armies of Napoleon. And the government was running out of money to sustain the war effort. And so the king of Prussia, modern-day Germany, King Frederick III, made an appeal to all the people to give their gold and silver to the war effort to free their country and to sustain their country for future generations. And anyone who gave gold or silver to the war effort would receive in return a piece of iron jewelry. And it might have been, a ring, or it might have been some kind of necklace, but whatever iron jewelry they received, all of it had this inscription on it: I gave gold for iron. And iron jewelry became a source of great pride and a symbol of national loyalty. And here's why people were willing to trade gold for iron: because they had a vision for the future of their nation and for generations to come. And because they trusted and loved their leader, King Frederick. And so because of that, they decided to take what they might otherwise want to stockpile for themselves and to use it for something that would affect people for generations to come. And they eventually did win the war and free their country. What is my vision? Who am I serving? Where's my treasure? And I love the fact that I get to be a part of a church where hundreds of people really get this. The reason why we're able to be a church that reaches more and more people, a church where people can hear about the message of hope in a way that's relevant and engaging, a place where people are growing in their faith and becoming difference makers every generation. The reason why we can be a church that does phenomenal things in the community, like give away 1 million diapers or 3,000 winter coats, or host something every year called Night to Shine, a prom night for people with special needs. The reason we can do all that is because hundreds of you get this, and you understand that those everyday, mundane decisions can make an eternal difference. We're going to close with one more song. It's really a prayer. It invites God to give us His vision for our lives and for this world. As the band sets up, just watch this with me.